Hello, my name is John. Last year, I traveled to Australia to learn English. It was my first time in another country, and I was both excited and nervous. When I arrived at the airport, everything felt new. The people spoke quickly, and I had to listen carefully to understand. I took a taxi to my new home, a small apartment near my English school. The next morning, I woke up early and walked to school. The weather was warm and the city was full of life. Cars rushed by, people laughed in cafes, and birds sang in the trees. At school, I met my teacher and classmates. Some were from different countries, just like me. The teacher smiled and said, "Welcome, everyone. Today we will practice speaking English." I felt nervous, but I knew I had to try. When it was my turn, I introduced myself. "Hello, my name is John. I came to Australia to learn English." The teacher nodded. "Good job, John. Don't worry, we are here to help you." I smiled, feeling a little more confident. This was just the beginning of my journey. After my first day of school, I decided to explore the city. I walked down the busy streets, looking at the tall buildings and shops. Everything was so different from my home country. I stopped at a small cafe and ordered a coffee. When the waiter spoke, I didn't understand everything he said. I felt shy, but I smiled and asked, "Can you repeat that, please?" He smiled and spoke more slowly. "Would you like sugar in your coffee?" I finally understood and said, "No, thank you." I felt proud of myself for using English in real life. As I walked back home, I thought about my day. Learning a new language was difficult, but I knew I was getting better. I told myself, every day I will learn something new. That night, I wrote in my notebook. I introduced myself in class. I ordered coffee in English. I learned a new word. Repeat. I smiled as I closed my notebook. Tomorrow would be another adventure. The next morning, I woke up early and felt excited for another day of learning. I got ready, grabbed my notebook, and walked to school. On the way, I saw a bakery with fresh bread and pastries. The smell was so good that I decided to buy something for breakfast. I walked inside and saw a friendly woman behind the counter. She smiled and said, "Good morning, what would you like?" I looked at the menu, but some words were new to me. I pointed at a pastry and asked, "What is this?" She replied, "That's a croissant. It's soft and buttery, very delicious." I smiled and said, "I'll take one, please." She handed me the croissant and I gave her the money. "Thank you," I said. "You're welcome. Have a great day," she replied. As I walked to school, I felt happy. I was learning new words and speaking more English every day. At school, our teacher gave us a new challenge. Today, you will practice speaking with a classmate about your daily life. I paired up with a student from Japan named Ken. He smiled and asked, "What do you do in the morning?" I thought for a moment and answered, "I wake up early, eat breakfast, and walk to school. Today I bought a croissant." Ken laughed and said, "I love croissants too." We continued talking, and I realized that English was becoming easier. Step by step, I was improving. That night, I wrote in my notebook again. I learned a new word, croissant. I spoke with the bakery lady. I had a conversation with my classmate. I smiled. Every day in Australia was a new adventure. The next morning, I woke up feeling more confident. I was getting better at speaking English, and I was excited to see what I would learn today. On my way to school, I stopped by the same bakery. This time, I wanted to try ordering without pointing. I smiled at the lady and said, "Good morning, I'd like a croissant, please." She smiled back. "Great. Anything else?" I hesitated for a moment but then asked, "Do you have any juice?" "Yes, we have orange and apple juice," she said. I thought for a moment and answered, "I'll take orange juice, please." She handed me my food, and I paid. "Your English is improving," she said kindly. I felt proud. "Thank you. Have a nice day," I replied. At school, the teacher gave us a new challenge. Today we will go outside and ask strangers for directions. I was nervous. Speaking to my classmates was easy, but talking to strangers felt scary. My partner was Ken again. We walked to a nearby park and saw a friendly-looking man. Ken encouraged me. "You can do it, John." I took a deep breath and asked, "Excuse me, where is the nearest supermarket?" The man smiled and pointed. "It's just 2 blocks that way. Turn left at the traffic light." I repeated, 2 blocks, then left at the traffic light? "Yes, you got it," he said. I thanked him and turned to Ken. "I did it," I said, feeling proud. That night, I wrote in my notebook again. I ordered food without pointing. I asked for directions in English. I understood a stranger's answer. I smiled to myself. Every day I was learning, and I was no longer afraid to speak English. A week had passed since I arrived in Australia, and I was feeling more comfortable speaking English. Every day I learned something new. One afternoon after school, Ken and I decided to explore the city. We walked through a busy shopping street, looking at stores and people. Suddenly, Ken stopped and pointed at a street performer. The man was playing the guitar and singing a beautiful song. A small crowd gathered around him, clapping and enjoying the music. Ken smiled. "Let's listen for a while." As we watched, the performer finished his song and looked at the audience. "Any song requests?" he asked. I wanted to say something but felt shy. Then Ken nudged me and whispered, "Go on, ask for a song." I took a deep breath and said, "Can you play Imagine by John Lennon?" The performer smiled. "Great choice. Here we go." As he started playing, I felt happy. I had spoken in English, and the musician understood me. After the song, Ken and I clapped and dropped some coins into his guitar case. "Thank you," I said. "You're welcome. Enjoy your day," the musician replied. That night, I wrote in my notebook again. I watched a street performance. I requested a song in English. I had a great conversation with Ken. I smiled as I closed my notebook. Every day in Australia was a new adventure, and I couldn't wait to see what would happen next. The next morning, I woke up feeling excited. It was Saturday, and Ken and I had planned a trip to the beach. It would be my first time seeing the Australian Ocean. We took a bus to Bondi Beach, one of the most famous beaches in Sydney. When we arrived, I was amazed. The sand was soft and golden, and the water was a beautiful shade of blue. Surfers rode the waves, and families relaxed under colorful umbrellas. Ken smiled. "Welcome to Bondi Beach." We walked along the shore, feeling the cool waves touch our feet. Then Ken asked, "Do you want to try surfing?" I hesitated. "I've never surfed before." "It's okay. Let's take a lesson," he said. We found a surf school and a friendly instructor greeted us. "Are you ready to learn?" he asked. I nodded. "Yes, but I might fall a lot." The instructor laughed. "That's part of the fun." He taught us how to stand on the board and balance. Then we went into the water. At first, I kept falling, but after a few tries, I managed to stand for a few seconds. Ken cheered. "John, you did it." I laughed, feeling proud. "This is harder than I thought, but it's so much fun." After our lesson, we sat on the sand, watching the sunset. The sky turned pink and orange, and the sound of the waves was peaceful. I took out my notebook and wrote, "I visited Bondi Beach. I took my first surfing lesson. I didn't give up, and I stood on the board." As I looked at the ocean, I smiled. Every day in Australia was a new adventure, and I was ready for more. After our fun day at Bondi Beach, I felt more confident about trying new things. Every experience was helping me learn English and become braver. On Monday, our teacher gave us a new challenge. Today, we will visit a local market. Your task is to buy something and have a short conversation with the seller. I was excited but also nervous. What if I didn't understand the seller? Ken and I walked to the market together. It was colorful and full of people. Stalls sold fresh fruit, handmade crafts, and souvenirs. The smell of delicious food filled the air. I stopped at a fruit stand. The seller smiled and said, "Hello, what can I get for you?" I looked at the fruit and asked, "How much are the apples?" "They are $3 each or $5 for two," she replied. I thought for a moment and said, "I'll take two, please." She handed me the apples and I gave her the money. "Here you go," she said cheerfully. I smiled. "Thank you. Have a nice day." "You too," she replied. As Ken and I walked away, he patted my shoulder. "You did great. Your English is improving every day." That night, I wrote in my notebook. I went to a local market. I bought apples and spoke to a seller. I felt more confident speaking English. I smiled as I closed my notebook. Every day in Australia was teaching me something new, and I couldn't wait to see what would happen next. A few days after my visit to the market, our teacher gave us another challenge. Today, I want each of you to tell a short story about your life. It can be about your hometown, your family, or a special experience. I felt a little nervous. Speaking in English was getting easier, but telling a full story in front of the class was different. Ken noticed my worried face and whispered, "You can do it, John. Just speak slowly and don't worry about mistakes." I took a deep breath and thought about what to say. When it was my turn, I stood up and smiled at my classmates. "Hello, everyone. Today, I want to tell you about my first day in Australia." I told them about arriving at the airport, feeling nervous and struggling to understand people. I talked about my first English conversation at the cafe and how proud I felt when I ordered a croissant. As I spoke, I realized something. I wasn't as scared as before. When I finished, the teacher clapped. "Great job, John. You spoke clearly and with confidence." Ken gave me a thumbs up. "I told you you could do it." That night, I wrote in my notebook. I told a story in front of my class. I spoke in English for 5 minutes without stopping. I felt more confident than ever. I smiled as I closed my notebook. Every day in Australia was an adventure, and I knew I was getting better. As the weeks passed, I felt more and more at home in Australia. I could order food, ask for directions, and have conversations with new people. My English had improved so much since the day I arrived. One evening, Ken and I decided to visit the Sydney Opera House. It was a beautiful building, glowing against the night sky. We sat by the harbor, watching the boats pass by. Ken turned to me and asked, "John, how do you feel about your time in Australia?" I thought for a moment and smiled. At first, I was nervous. Everything was new, and I was afraid of making mistakes. But now I feel more confident. I've learned so much, not just English, but also about different cultures and people. Ken nodded. That's what traveling does. It teaches us in ways a classroom never can. As I watched the water sparkle under the city lights, I realized how much I had changed. When I first arrived, I was afraid to speak. Now I was having full conversations without fear. The next morning, I packed my suitcase. My time in Australia was coming to an end, but I knew this was only the beginning of my journey. At the airport, I took out my notebook one last time and wrote, "I explored a new country. I made great friends. I became confident in speaking English." I smiled as I closed the notebook. I had come to Australia to learn English, but I had learned so much more. As the plane took off, I looked out the window and whispered, "Goodbye, Australia. I'll be back someday."